Why do I really care about Web3? Is it because I think the technology is transformative and will change the whole universe in all sorts of great ways and liberate us from big tech? No, not on its own. But does it create some real opportunities?
Hello friends, Jess here from Seed Club. Welcome to Season 3 of Building at the Edges. We host conversations with the top innovators, thinkers, and builders at the intersection of crypto and community. I'm very excited to bring you this conversation with Nathan Schneider. Nathan is a professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He directs the Media Enterprise Design Lab there. He has written extensively about the cooperative movement and even co-published with Vitalik. Nathan sits at this really interesting intersection between the cooperative movement and Web3. In this conversation, we spent much of our time digging into Nathan's article, Web3 is the opportunity we've had all along, Innovation Amnesia, and Economic Democracy. Drop that in the show notes. It's a must read in my opinion. And ended up in a conversation talking about community ownership and if people even want it and are ready for it. I had some technical issues on the audio in this recording, so apologies in advance, but I think you'll find that this conversation is incredibly rich and nuanced and very, very worth your time. So let's get into it. Nathan, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
Awesome. You want to just give yourself like a real brief introduction? I think I'll have done a good enough job capturing it in the intro, but I'd love to hear it from your voice as well.
Yeah, I teach in media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. I have a lab there called the Media Enterprise Design Lab. So I work with students on experimenting with democratic ownership and governance there. And I'm involved in the Meta Governance Project, which is kind of research collective on online governance. It's a co-founder of a co-op accelerator called Start.Coop, and work with Zebras Unite, a network of founders trying to change the startup economy. So all sorts of stuff, all about really how do we do this tech thing more democratically, more accountably? How do we make it work for us rather than working for somebody else's profits? That's kind of where all these things converge for me.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like both coming at this thing from very similar and yet probably different starting points. Like for me, it was this feeling of being very active as Web 2 was becoming a thing and just seeing how quickly like the negative impacts of that came out, and not the negative impacts of that we're probably dealing with the most right now, which is like, censorship or online mobs or misinformation spread, but more from this feeling of investing time, heartbeats, creating value for these networks and not having a say or capturing that value. And at the same time, not sort of exploring that through the cooperative lens. Like there was something there that didn't quite click for me. I think I came at it from sort of I was fascinated with startups. I kind of came of age, I guess, when that was like the big thing, and it was captivating in so many ways. And I think that the thing that's so fascinating with me about Web3 is that it kind of ideally will bring those two worlds together, this opportunity to create something big and valuable, something worth owning, something that has resources, and also where ownership and governance or decision-making is more distributed. And I think like the place that I would love to start in this conversation, I think there's an article or a paper that you published recently that I think I have deep appreciation for people who add language or new words or new concepts that crystallize ideas that I've sort of just been feeling. It's kind of been a cloud. I think that's both like the most exciting part for me about building the space and also the most frustrating is like how incomplete the words are that we use. And I think your paper, which I want to make sure I get it right, is Web3 is the opportunity we have had all along, innovation, amnesia, and economic democracy. I think to me, I was reading that and I said it to all our team, I'm like, this is the thing, because there's such nuance in trying to, it almost feels like splitting hairs in the broader context and fervor that exists in the space that Web3 or crypto. And there's such an important distinction that I feel between what we're building at Seed Club and the types of teams that we work with and maybe just the broad thing that most people engage with crypto around. And I think your paper does an incredible job there. Do you want to maybe sort of kick us off with what the intent there was and maybe the basic thesis? And then I'd love to get into some of the details.
Yeah, thanks for that. Because the intent for me is an important thing to get out because I've been working between these two worlds. I got involved I was a reporter trying to cover the early development of Ethereum back in 2014. And since then, have been kind of keeping involved in the crypto and Web3 world and fascinated by it, terrified by it, all these things, but generally like deeply committed to the idea that this is important. There's something important happening here. And at the same time, I've been involved in the world of cooperatives and economic justice. People who often are very skeptical or outright hostile to what's going on in crypto, often for very good reasons. And I found that I've often speaking to them very separately, and to the co-op people emphasizing, you all need to wake up and see that, there are possibilities of creativity and exploration that are just not happening here. Let's do that. And then in crypto, where that exploration and creativity is happening, I keep being like, there's a whole history of economic democracy, and you're not making up co-ownership here. And there's a lot of lessons you can learn here. And you all have some backwards ideas on a few really important things. So I was always emphasizing, criticizing on each side and emphasizing different things. And I wanted to write something that would kind of explain to both why I care about the other. Situate, why do I really care about Web3? Is it because I think the technology is transformative and will change the whole universe in all sorts of great ways and liberate us from big tech? No, not on its own. But does it create some real opportunities? Yes. And where are those opportunities? Well, those opportunities are kind of framed by this longer tradition of economic justice. And so it was an attempt to kind of put these conversations I'd been having separately together into something that would kind of speak to both. And, you just said you shared it in your organization. One thing I really appreciate too is, I've heard from friends on the more economic justice side saying the same thing. I shared this in my organization to help us have a conversation about crypto. And bridging those two has been kind of a dream for me for a long time, and has been what I've been holding in my head and in my work for years now. So the goal here too is to explain in a moment where Web3 is really polarizing in a lot of contexts. And the question is often whether this thing should exist, whether crypto is good or bad. And I just don't see it that way at all. I've been around it long enough to see, first of all, it's growing fast enough that that's not really a question we can ask anyway. It's happening. And two, it's just not a very interesting question. The much more interesting question is how. That to me is, the most important. It's also a reason why I last year went about editing a collection of Vitalik Buterin's essays with him, was that he is so deep in that question of how. And that's a conversation that so many of us in the crypto universe have been having, and that is not visible outside. So the goal there again was to introduce more people to those much more interesting questions of how, put less emphasis on what everybody else is seeing, which is number go up, number go down, scam 1, scam 2, scam 3, all these kinds of things that are in some ways kind of peripheral to what is most interesting and powerful about what's going on here.
I mean, I love that, even that simple framing of the whether versus the how. I think that captures the difference in experience so clearly that I think and maybe we, how we experience crypto and Web3 versus how those, not in the rabbit hole experience it. It's a far more interesting question, far more complex question. The framing that you use to sort of open the space for that exploration, I think, is really quite fascinating. You talk about the amnesia of innovation, and I love this line. The deer in the headlights effect as a new technological paradigm shines brightly enough that people freeze and forget to apply once stable and still applicable social contracts to it. Can you unpack that idea for us a bit?
Yeah. So this idea of amnesia around innovation is something I've been trying to name and puzzle with for a while. It's something, going back to my work with tech cooperatives and platform cooperatives, one thing we encountered a lot was this amnesia around gig platforms, which in a lot of ways felt really bad. It was okay, Uber shows up and suddenly decades of taxi policy and regulation, this kind of equilibrium, even if it was a bad equilibrium, suddenly goes away, and policymakers forget that there was a framework for this, or forget that people who work for a company exclusively really should probably be designated as employees. All these things that Airbnb, suddenly long fought for labor agreements around hospitality industries in entire cities, get upended by this platform, and suddenly the rules don't get applied to this thing because it uses new tech. And over we see that, where tech becomes this shiny object that distracts us from the fact that, why are we not applying old rules? And sometimes that's been really frustrating because it allows companies to get away with essentially injustice, get away with a kind of free lunch. On the other hand, I do think these are kind of necessary and powerful moments. In the context of Uber, for instance, the taxi industries probably did need to get upended in some way. And also in crypto, there is a really interesting phenomenon I see, which is this sense that we are doing everything for the first time. This again is that sense of amnesia, forgetting that, for instance, forms of co-ownership and alternative currency systems and so forth. None of this existed until Satoshi launched Bitcoin in 2009, right? That's the kind of general thinking. And a part of me wants to be like, come on, learn your history. You know, this is part of longer trajectories. But when I watch what's going on and participate in it, it's actually very exciting. For instance, there are interfaces and modes of self-governance happening in these spaces that I don't see in existing cooperative legacies. There are forms of worker co-governance that I think are really interesting and I'm not seeing in labor unions or cooperatives today. And even just like putting new names on things like, you know, calling proxy voting, you know, delegation or liquid democracy, then new interfaces come into it and it suddenly starts to mean something different. And you're playing with the term, you get to play in a way that you wouldn't if you just adopted the old language and if you just felt that kind of trappedness in history. So to me, this innovation amnesia is a very ambivalent thing. It's something that is dangerous and something that we should be very anxious about when it is used to assert monopoly power, for instance, over once locally controlled industries and against workers' rights. At the same time, sometimes it's something we deeply need when we get trapped, when we get stuck, when we get locked into a pattern that limits the sense of possibilities that we have.
I want to dive into that, but I think that this other piece that I often feel is, I don't know if it's like it's such a part of my worldview, but is rarely just sort of clearly articulated in the way that I think you articulate it here, which, you know, a line I pulled out here is in capitalist economies, wealth accumulation tends to derive from business ownership. That fundamental idea that I think many people bristle against for, I think, a number of reasons, to me seems like very, very true, very relevant, and also like an absolute sort of core, at least to my worldview, around why it's so important for us to, you know, engage in the distribution of ownership over these networks. It's not purely one of having a say over, or the fact that maybe I disagree with some of the policies of these networks. It's the fact that I have no pathway, legally no pathway to distribute ownership to these things. Like Uber and Airbnb, I believe, are still engaged in a court battle right now to actually be able to give equity to their workers and are unable to do that. And of course, like doing that today versus doing that at day one with the first Uber driver who was probably recommending thousands of people come join is a very different world. And so that ability to participate in this growth and upside seems like, I just think about it as the difference between living in these sort of medieval times with, you know, no private property and then living in the modern times where we have private property. And there are a ton of negatives that kind of come with it, but it's pretty difficult to deny just the distribution of wealth that has come from that. And also sort of this recognition that it is the world that we live in. And yes, I appreciated that sort of direct call out. Would you consider that sort of core thesis or piece of the work that you do here, or am I just projecting that on you?
No, it's a premise, right? And there's this chart that I just sit with all the time. It goes back a few years, but they call it the jaws of the snake. And it's like one line is going up, and then one line around the 1970s goes flat. And before they were together, this is a picture of the United States economy. The line that's going up is GDP, just wealth being produced, keeps going up, and especially, you know, wealth going to capital. You know, you could look at the same chart and see the stock markets, and then the line that goes flat is the amount of wealth going to workers. That's wage increase, real wages, you know, flat line, especially as worker power starts to decline. And that to me is just, you know, it provokes a lot of questions. Like, well, we could have a world in which wealth was not attached to ownership, and in which like the wage was the primary way of distributing wealth in the economy. And okay, that's kind of interesting. And maybe that's what we want to fight for. That's what labor unions are, you know, struggling and failing to fight for today. That's kind of the model that they exist for, is to try to keep wages in tune with the growth of wealth to capital. Another approach is to say, no, we need to just really broadly expand access to ownership and make sure that is equitable in diverse sorts of ways. You know, in some ways, I'm kind of indifferent about how we distribute wealth as long as, you know, we have a fair society. But there are certain advantages around ownership. One is that it's a kind of citizenship. So it invites people into like being full self, full people, especially when ownership is like recoded appropriately, enables people to be more than just economic actors in their relationship to an entity. And the cooperative movement really does this. And some DAOs, for instance, do this. The cooperative movement reprograms equity into this like one person, one vote thing with a strong mission orientation, and makes it mean something different than like having stock in a company. And, it's not tradable in the same way. This idea of programming tokens, again, is not that new. But another thing about ownership is that, I'm kind of that kind of utopian bent where, like, I don't think jobs are the greatest thing ever. Back in, Abraham Lincoln's time on the campaign trail when he was running for president, he talked about wage labor as like kind of on the road to slavery, that abolition of slavery should also probably involve abolition of wage labor. And maybe you would do it a little bit like, working at a fast food restaurant when you're a teenager just to make some extra cash before you like buy your own farm. That was the vision of, free labor that existed in the United States in the mid 19th century that got totally erased by industrialization. But there's something to that, the idea that, hey, shouldn't our goal be to not have to work for somebody else, to really be able to pursue our own ends, to set our own agenda, to just wake up in the morning and decide what we want to do with our own day. And ownership can be a pathway to that, especially the kind of wealth that comes through ownership is a kind in which it's not based on you showing up every moment. It's about your attachment, your relationship to a productive activity. To me, a kind of gateway to a more liberated society.
I think that is such a powerful graph. And I think the returns to capital versus wage growth, and it's striking. And I think what's interesting to me is when I hear other, mostly economists, sort of speak to that graph, they sort of speak to it with like a big shrug, like weird. Like, I don't think there's actually a good argument for why this is happening, or a reason for why this is happening. But it sounds like in your view, there is a very clear reason for why this is happening. Part of that is sort of decrease in power of labor unions. Was there something that happened back then, or what was that shift? Why did we have to see that separation if we were looking at it through the lens of like participation and ownership in these assets?
I think we see it at a moment where participation in labor unions, I think labor unions are the crucial part of that story there. And that has to do also with the disruption of 1970s inflation, and then particularly Reaganomics and the kind of breaking of the back of the American labor movement. And when I look at that chart, I just see collective power. That is collective power and the lack of it. That's what happens. The invisible force there is, the loss of collective power. And, which isn't to say that labor unions are perfect entities in any sort of way. I mean, I'm part of one, it's got its issues. They all have their issues. But they do one thing pretty well, which is they increase wages of workers. They have a very good economic alignment toward that goal. And so this is precisely why they were attacked, is that they were harming the returns to capital. So what goes in that gap? Maybe it is, more union organizing. I think that doesn't hurt. But actually, I'm really interested in other kinds of answers. I'm interested in what other kinds of collective power can we build that are fuller extensions of the term. There's a sign down in a town near me, Lafayette, Colorado, that is a marker memorializing a strike of coal workers in that town, sitting at the museum just outside. And I love passing by it because it mentions the fact that the workers were from the industrial workers of the world, a pre-New Deal union that was very explicit about the fact that its goal was not just to get better wages and conditions, but to actually own the means of production, for workers to be in control ultimately. That was the goal. In 1938, with the New Deal labor relations law, that changed. Labor relations became all about, okay, we accept, the capitalist class, our job, we get certain rights to make sure that we get our keep from that class. And in some ways that was really powerful. It enabled growth of the middle class. It enabled like this great access to a situation where a factory worker could support a whole family for, a brief period in American history, right? But it gave up on that idea that we should be full citizens in the economy, which was the radical ambition of the dominant labor unions in the early 20th and late 19th century. What's striking to me is to see that desire, that possibility, that sense of possibility of shared ownership and collective action coming back in the context of crypto and the context of a revived cooperative movement. And I think we need to raise those ambitions again. When you are building tokenized communities, you're building forms of collective action that aren't just about opposing someone who's in power. It's about, hey, let's see if we can build our own jurisdiction, our own space of citizenship. In some sense, okay, maybe it's like it seems very mundane. It's a multi-sig with a Discord or whatever. But there's also something very powerful in that. There's something radical that departs from, a pre-existing dominant social contract to the 20th century, but also that is prefigured by the ambitions of workers and others long before that. So it's a form of innovation, but it's also a form of memory.
I find that fascinating. Just sort of sitting with this feeling of, well, I mean, use the word amnesia. I think for myself, I feel very much in the middle of and exploring and really only looking maybe a few steps ahead of my face in many ways, just this like feeling through. And that's how I would broadly describe my experience in building C Club to where it is today, with, a deep appreciation for history, but not that explicit, sort of seeing that line between, and to know there was sort of like this moment in time where small decisions kind of led to a fairly different set of outcomes. And I guess we sort of find ourselves in that moment again here today. And I think I also have this deep belief in narratives and the power of narratives, and that when those narratives start to change, the opportunity that sort of emerges when those narratives change. And I feel like that's very well captured in your piece, and also sort of the moment we sit in here. And I think this idea of collective amnesia is a useful framing there, I think, both to draw sort of attention to positive and negatives, either realities that come from that, but also really feeling this pull to the appreciation for having these new gaps that exist for us to be able to sort of explore new possibilities there. And it really starts to lead me, to think about like, what are the rules or the guidelines or the things we should be aware of when we're sort of trying to embody both these realities at the same time? How do we navigate both the benefits of that collective amnesia and also the obvious potential downsides?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious how you tell those stories, because I'm not sure how best to blend them, because I often feel like I'm, actually, when I put that essay out, some people wrote to me publicly, Glenn Weil, who's, worked a lot with Vitalik and stuff, and, has been a collaborator, saying, aren't you going to dampen the creative energy, by saying this is all just part of an old thing? And I buy that. I think there's something real and kind of dangerous that I'm doing, and like being the sad sack who's always like, well, remember history, and I'm at the same time super grateful that people are kind of forgetting history. And so in some sense, I want to alternate. I want both. I want us to be able to like go into history mode, into storytelling mode, and then at the same time go into moments where we throw that all away and we see ourselves where we are and try to imagine, and then maybe reflect on that experience. In some ways I want the extremes. I don't want a happy middle. How do you do that? What is the mythology that you tell in Seed Club? Like, what is the bigger story that these communities are part of?
So I have thoughts on that. Just a reflection on your previous statement. I saw you engaging with the history, not as a dampening effect, but an empowering one. It's sort of like an acknowledgement of where we are or where we've come from that creates more pragmatism, more realness, more possibilities, not fewer. My experience is one of seeing the fairly, immediate downsides of over-indexing on ideological drive or over-optimism around things, especially when we're trying to actually engage in the creation of something that lives in the real world with real people, with real power structures that are inevitable and everything. And so I think looking at that through that lens for me was one that was like, let's acknowledge it so we can actually go run over here with more confidence.
Yeah, and I felt that with the co-op world for years. Almost every week, sometimes every day, I'm having conversations with founders of new co-ops. And a lot of it has been frustrating because they run into a lot of barriers, because for various reasons, the economic and financial system is really tuned against them. But something I think about all the time in those conversations is down the road from me, an hour south, is this thing called CoBank, which is this massive multi-$100 billion cooperative bank that came out of organizing and entrepreneurship among farmers in the United States from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, and then evolved into a kind of modern form. And it's this massive financing engine for those co-ops, supported by federal policy and all this sort of thing. And it's a reminder to me that this stuff has been done before, and here are some pathways for how to do that. And so when I see those startups, I see like the possibility of something much bigger often than they see, because, they're just looking at what's in front of them. I think of like my grandfather who ran something I didn't know when I started working on co-ops, but learned later that the last thing he worked on, he grew up as a farmer on a farm with no electricity and ended up becoming the director of a national cooperative in the hardware business. And so, having that sense of like multi-billion-dollar energy, scale, as something that you see in a building like the CoBank headquarters that, know in my family history, somehow makes it feel much more possible. Okay. And also makes one recognize how wrong it is that the system currently prevents that stuff. You see the barriers when you know your history too. You see that, okay, this barrier doesn't need to be there. So often people, especially, entrepreneurs, assume the rules of the game as kind of fixed natural laws because they have to, because it's a beneficial mindset for them. And they have to say, okay, these are the rules. Within those rules, I'm going to play the game. And I'm going to bend the rules a little bit, but I still have to know the rules. The benefit of where I sit, not having to, be an entrepreneur to play in those rules, I get to see lots of them interact with those rules and notice where are the places where those rules are really getting in the way and where they don't have to be that way. When I started building this accelerator co-op, one thing that was really important to me was to connect it to an older legacy, and ended up co-founding it with Greg Brodsky, who is the son he grew up watching his father build a multi-billion-dollar co-op in the carpet business. So, he was an owner of a small carpet store, said, hey, all of us, we're competing with each other. There are lots of things we could do together. Let's buy these rugs together, and built a national, massive business that is co-owned by local businesses. And that connection is so important because I wanted every founder that comes through to not only experience like the new hip tech co-ops that are coming up, but also like to see what it looks like to achieve massive scale and to get to know somebody who has gone through that process and see themselves there.
Yeah, there's rarely a day that goes by where I don't feel a deep appreciation for the seat that I found myself in, being able to see the brilliance of so many different types of people going after different types of things within a same general space. And, I'm just a voracious learner. And this is like the most real, most, emergent type of learning possible to see that. And I think to your question earlier, I think like what is interesting in the space that we try to design is one where, I think it's very rare for an accelerator, let's call C-Club an accelerator, to come out and be both in the process of trying to figure out what the thing is and then also support others to do the thing, right? So it's like, what's a DAO? What's a tokenized community? How do you do that well? And then how can we help other people do that well? And I think what that creates is the space of the only sort of confident space that I can live in, and I think that C-Club can live in, is this idea of constant exploration, of not being here as the experts and rather being here as like the honest, passionate explorers of what's possible. And I find that the places where I feel the most anxiety or out of sorts, or when I have sort of stepped over that for whatever, because maybe my Twitter following is big, or I'm looking to, have to go speak on a stage or something, and I have to sort of step into that confident piece at that meta level that I think is very uncomfortable because I don't know what the answer is here. And I think that's actually the most powerful position to be in. And so when we bring smart people together who are doing the things, what we get to be a part of is co-creating this reality. And we very much live both in the sort of general belief in the narrative and the possibility, which I think is hazy and more of a feeling than anything. And then also in the very real, pragmatic space of needing to build and execute and build structures and figure this sort of stuff out. And so I think, your question around sort of my question and then your question with the Uno reverse card around sort of this amnesia is both like, I think we lean far more into that space of like the new opportunities that amnesia provides, but you don't have to take too many steps down that path to be hit with the real challenges. And it's at that moment where it just seems so ridiculous to not turn around and be like, well, hold on, like this has got to have been solved somewhere else before. And indeed, it almost always has in some way, or at least there's a deep body of work that we can start to pull from. So I think that's I guess you're describing a tension that will probably always exist. And I'm answering it with saying that, yeah, we just like to live in that tension.
Yeah. And especially in a world where like nothing is quite replicable, right? I mean, this has been an issue. I think one of the biggest transitional challenges that often is not noticed in co-op legacy is that, things like credit unions or rural electric cooperatives or agricultural cooperatives, they grew because they figured out a model that worked in one place, but it could only serve that one place. So then you just replicate the thing all over, and you have a million of them. When we're working on networks the way we are now, you kind of can't do that, because if you have one thing on the network, that's the things on the network, anybody can join it. And so each story is unique. And that's something, I've also been having to do with the in the context of this exit to community meme that I came up with when I started realizing, lots of these startups I'm working with, they're never going to be co-ops. They're never going to, you can't graft them into that model. Let's figure out what can we possibly do to bring community ownership into what they're doing. And so let's invite them in. And again, I'm talking to founders all the time who are trying to puzzle their way through this meme, right? That provides no maps, no models, but it's a menu of models, and it's a menu of legacies and possibilities, things that are old, things that are new. And the invitation is to say, okay, let's do these together, share notes with each other, and be explorers, just as you said there. Again, I don't have a model to give you. I want to learn from what you figure out. And, among the projects that have kind of taken up that challenge, I'm learning so much.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how powerful technology, a compass, is. Yeah, everybody yearns for a map, and yet I think the direction that these organizations, and I think, you talk about meme, it's something we talk about a ton in our work, and just that's narrative or brand, or whatever you want to roll up into that. Just the power of exit to community ownership, these community-owned networks it's powerful, and I think it's the thing that is there's a crazy amount of alignment in the pursuit of that. If you think about just the realm of total possibilities that exist out there, I feel like we could just sit down and drink coffee for a couple hours and nerd out over this sort of stuff, which I'm going to try to make happen at some point. But there's a couple pieces here that are coming out that I think your note on exit to community. One of the things that I've sort of been struggling with, I guess, is a more powerful way of saying that, is this idea of ownership, and the idea of, do people really want ownership? Are we ready for ownership? And I think you see this come out in bits when you look at some of the token distributions to DAOs and how quickly they're dumped. I think there was, maybe 7% of original Uniswap token receiving wallets still hold on to those tokens. And maybe one of the narratives you could pull from that is that people don't want ownership. They don't value it. They don't see value in it. And therefore, this whole endeavor of trying to distribute ownership is actually doomed to fail.
I love that provocation. It's so real. And I come at this from my kind of deepest sympathy is among political traditions is with the anarchist tradition, in which property is theft. So ownership is I've devoted my entire career to supporting a concept that actually I deep down disavow. Also, I'm a Roman Catholic, and we have this concept in Catholic tradition called, on days when I wonder, why am I still a Catholic? This concept keeps me in the church. The universal destination of goods, which is this beautiful, very simple idea with a very fancy name, that all things are ultimately God's gift to the world, right? They're everybody's. But, okay, there was the fall, right, in the kind of Christian mythology. And so we are imperfect. We are unable to realize that reality. And property is this tool by which we nevertheless are able to live and steward that gift in some kind of way. And yet we cannot simply hold property, that ultimately we have to treat property in a way that recognizes that it is ultimately not ours. And that's how I think about ownership. So that concept leads me to the sense in which we have to ask, what kind of ownership do we mean? And that, the neat thing about people in the kind of meat space world tend to think they know what ownership is, even though they don't, right? Lawyers talk about it as a bundle of rights. Owning a cat is different from owning a house, is different from owning a wheelbarrow. You have different rights in terms of what you're able to do to those things. You can get in trouble for mistreating your cat, even if you own it in certain jurisdictions, right? And owning a house can mean something kind of weird if actually the bank sort of owns it. And there are all kinds of little fissures in ownership already. And then when you look at this cooperative tradition, which has really a very different programming of ownership than equity stock, the kind of usual stock market buying and selling. There's a lot more friction on buying and selling. There isn't the same sense of market valuation. They both go under the name ownership, but they actually mean something different. What's neat about crypto is that it says, okay, you get to code what ownership means. Actually, that's always been the case in certain respects. We've encoded it into law, we've encoded it into norms. But here we have a chance to play in a new sandbox. I guess one thing that I'm very concerned about legally is just to make sure that we get to keep that sandbox going, that we don't just, as regulation comes into this space, that we don't just map the subjectivity of the investor onto all of this stuff anew and lock it down again, that we keep this space of play. And then when we get to ask those questions about what kind of ownership is actually appropriate. What kind of ownership would people want to keep if we want them to keep it? What kind of governance would actually make sense for people to participate in? And, I love that question. And it's one that I think is so exciting in certain respects. Like, what would it look like to live in a world in which, rather than having mainly consumer relationships with most things that we relate to, we would have ownership relationships and yet still have like some control over our attention, right? Be able to decide what are the things I really want to put my energy into and not, and be able to entrust power to others who do want to put energy into something. What kind of dashboards should we wake up to in a world in which we are co-owners of dozens or hundreds of things? What does it look and feel like? How do we make sure to allocate attention, time, energy, analysis, stewardship, love, care, childcare, all these things that get involved when you're a part of a community? And I've had all these conversations with DAO founders where, they get going and they're like, oh gosh, only, 3% of token holders are voting. I'm like, yeah, that's lots of big co-ops have that situation too when they when they don't make any effort to get people to vote. And often they don't intentionally because they don't want people to actually have control. And then I think of the Colorado Rural Electric Co-ops, when they have an annual meeting, it's a big party. You have lots of food and you have a guy dressed in a robot costume and, there's stuff for kids and that makes people turn out. But then there are other kinds of things where maybe you don't actually want people to turn out and that's okay. You can just entrust others. So I think it just invites us to ask that question of what kinds of relationships do we have to a particular project? The question often I think is, what does accountability look like? How do you make sure that the accountability is there at some level, even if it doesn't involve everybody voting on every proposal, because that is completely unsustainable, right? Or assuming that everybody's gonna, hold and care about every token that they have equally. Of course not. Of course not. And we want a world in which we can have inequalities of relationship, where we can have loose ties and strong ties. To me, that is just we've got to think about that as a creative challenge and as a place of play, rather than as oh gosh, people are stupid, forget them.
Yeah, I love that framing. One of my deep beliefs is this idea of this narrative, this sense of wanting to be a part of something is so core to this idea of ownership, right? That there's speculative ownership, which feels much more short term and more investor like, and I think is how most people engage with crypto right now. The price doubles, triples, 100x's, you'd be an idiot not to sell at that point. And yet there are people who don't. And I think where I see that happening is where I think our mutual friend, Austin Roby is at Meta Label right now. I'm assuming you guys know each other.
Yeah, of course.
He's just so passionate about being in the places where he believes his values are being seen and where he, the sense of belonging and participation. And I think from the broader crypto market, that can look like almost, let's just call it a toy, right? It looks small and not scalable. And is there really a there? And I think that's, potentially fair criticism today. But when I think about the long-term sustainability of these token networks that we're building, I fail to see how any of these things maintain and grow their value if you are not able to capture that core piece. And so it's not just about governance, but it's about this identity or, cultural relevance. Or we talk a lot about, what is the big adventure, right? So token holders are buying a ticket to an adventure, which comes with both all the highs and lows that a good adventure might come with. And that the right people to get on that adventure, the people who identify with and want to be there for that. And of course, there's different token models that I think can emerge. And there's this balancing between, we need to acknowledge that the speculative nature of the space is why there's so much capital in the space that allows me to do the job that I'm doing right now and for many of the things that we're doing out within the C Club ecosystem. And yet I sort of hold this reality or truth or belief that speculation can serve us insofar as it drives that baseline deeper connection and belief. And then you layer on your comments even about networks around how replicable is this? And I think there is just enough, but it can be over-indexed upon. And I think it's at that narrative or meme level that the exploration of everything from token value to governance and ownership really lives. Maybe to counter my point a little bit, I think the risk I see, maybe that doesn't take hold big enough. Maybe it isn't scalable. Maybe we run into Dunbar's number and that's a limit thing. I don't think it anyways, let me go down that path still. Where most people do not feel a tie into the thing. And if I was given a whole $100,000 worth of Facebook tokens, would I still be holding $100,000 worth of Facebook tokens today? And the answer is, I don't know, but likely most people wouldn't. And then all of a sudden we get back into this concentrated power because people with capital would be able to accumulate those sort of things. So this tension between like speculation, capital and accumulation, and the desire to have more participation and ownership, I think is actually a lot more at odds than we like to acknowledge.
I think there's something kind of fundamentally scary about the state of crypto, which is like a financial system without a real economy. It's what, lots of economists I respect have been warning about the rest of the economy, except on steroids. At the same time, it does create that froth, and it enables that, just as you said, it enables that fuel into this ecosystem in a way that, for instance, in a lot of the solidarity economy and other attempts at circular economies and alternative currencies, a lot of this stuff has been done in other contexts where that speculative fuel isn't there, and it just doesn't grow. It hasn't taken hold in a way that this crazy crypto world has. So even though I'm kind of inclined to resist speculation and to suspect it, I have to give it that credit. And it also has created stakes for these governance experiments. Suddenly, when these projects show up and they have, millions or more dollars worth of tokens under their stewardship, and they have to quickly figure out what to do with that. And sometimes it fails spectacularly, and sometimes they figure out some really cool stuff, and probably both are happening at once. It's fuel for growth and fuel for creativity that I'm not sure I would want to give up too quickly. At the same time, in this context, I've been, really vocal about the need to make sure that an economic logic is not the driving force of this stuff. And that's where I think the kinds of cultures that you're talking about building are so important, is first of all, thinking about that in culture and in making sure that in these communities, people don't see themselves as just financial actors, but think of themselves as full participants, as people who are there for a reason, and are getting intangible value about it, and also can bring something closer to their whole selves to it. And then also to build tools that reflect that, tools that reflect not just our financial incentives, but that treat us as human beings. So I think, for instance, I think there are flaws and so forth with the idea of soul-bound tokens, right, that Vitalik has floated. But I think it's actually a really important step to even just talk about that, to talk about the importance of something that is of designing around humans, not just around economic flows and incentives. If all we do is design around incentives, we create humans who are purely economic actors, and those are really boring humans, and also I think really dangerous humans. So that cultural component combined with our mechanism design, our tech design, is so powerful. And one thing that I found in doing research on crypto economics in the wild was that I would look at a DAO, for instance, and say, oh, this looks like a very speculative activity. Wow, you're all just in it for the money. And then I would, write that and share it with people in that DAO, and they'd say, no, you don't understand this at all. That's not how we think about it. We have a culture, and then I had to rewrite it and rethink it and recognize, I was not seeing the human side of it. And I think we also have to have a world for both, right? I'm a member of a fairly large credit union. I don't really want to be involved in governance of it. I hate spreadsheets. I have no qualification for it, but I'm glad that some people do. And, thank you. Good luck. I treat it transactionally. On the other hand, I'm a member of an investment club that's small and enables the members to learn about cooperatives in Colorado, and it's designed to be participatory. We all make decisions together, and it's kind of a fiat DAO of a certain respect, and that's something where I get value out of participating. I learn through participation, and I think we need to make sure we have room for both.
Deeply appreciate this conversation. I love these ones where I have like so many notes and we only get past the first 3 points that I've made here. And I'm like, there's a lot more to get into. I think on your last point there, you have this really wonderful document that you've been a participant in called Notes on Governance Experience Design, that I think if people are interested in this sort of human approach to designing these systems, it's short, succinct, powerful. We'll make sure it's in the show notes. So I encourage people to go look at that. I also want to just call out the work that you've done through Community Rule, which I think is just an incredible resource for communities to engage in a thing that I see happening all the time, which is this idea of not having, like, that we are building structureless organizations, which is just, I know you have thoughts on that, and maybe that's a conversation in the future, but Community Rule is just a wonderful toolkit for, at the very least, starting to think about what are these structures, rules that we can put into place to allow us to have fun and create valuable games that we play. Nathan, really appreciate you sharing this time. It feels very long overdue, and this conversation here has only made that feel more evident. Where would you like to direct people's attention? Where can people find out more about what you're working on right now?
Thank you for that. And I would love to keep this conversation going. You can see recent articles on my website at nathanschneider.info or Media Enterprise Design Lab website at CU Boulder. If anybody is looking for a master's program to deepen their explorations of ownership and governance, we're taking applications now for next year. And, for those kinds of projects, check out the Meta Governance Project, which is an open community. We have weekly seminars and a Slack and just space for conversation exchange among hundreds of people exploring online governance and trying to dream together this future in which democratic ownership and governance are just the water we swim in, and our technology is built accordingly. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I know Nicole is got a foot in the MetaGov world, and she continues to sing its praises. So definitely go check that out. All right, man. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Take care.
Hello, friends. Steph here, Media Team Steward at Seed Club. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review Building at the Edges. This helps other Web3 builders discover these valuable insights. And tell us what you think on Twitter. Tag us at SeedClubHQ. Thanks for listening. See you on the internet.